Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to Benoît Dosti and Jean Poirier and SIX for inviting us to this conference. This paper is a collaboration with Charles Fleury, who's right here, and who will answer questions with me afterwards. He led this analysis, and we also collaborated with Guillaume Amirli, who's a doctoral candidate at Université Laval, and we are co-supervising Guillaume. So this presentation is part of a larger SSHRC-funded project on the impact of immigrant status on different outcomes. I'm not an expert on income, so this is one really aspect of much bigger question. And we're particularly interested in the status of temporary residence among workers on experiences and outcomes. So in this presentation, we asked the question of are temporary foreign workers or an underclass of employees. And in this talk, in this analysis, we focus on workers who are employees. I'll come back to this. So it's a very well-known fact that there has been a very important increase in temporary workers over the past few decades in Canada, and that it's a global phenomenon that we observe in other parts of the world as well, also in developed countries of Asia, where I've also done work on temporary workers. It's a very popular approach in migration policies and welcomed by employers because they desire this very flexible foreign workforce, designed to answer short-term needs of the labor market. However, a lot of existing research, particularly from more qualitative researchers and other groups such as labor rights activists and unions, have been very critical of temporary work programs, and they view them as a source of precariousness and vulnerability. So we could think here of the large body of research we have on agricultural workers in Ontario and Quebec that indicate how some of the provisions of these programs make workers potentially precarious. And here we can mention the obligation to work for one employer, the employer's power over workers in terms of evaluating them and having power over whether they may return or not the following year and be part of the program. Also, there are also a lot of criticisms about the differential rights between different groups according to skill level. Some who have access to permanent residency, some who don't, some who can migrate with family members, some who cannot. So all of this has been very much criticized by the qualitative research. However, these studies, and I've conducted some myself on agricultural workers in Ontario and in Quebec, are always very, of course, focused on small samples and very specific locations. We have fewer quantitative studies about temporary workers. And part of this is the difficulty to access the administrative data, and we have relatively much less data on temporary workers than on permanent immigrants, residents, who are, of course, are included in most of our data. So in this analysis, very focused, specific analysis, we're also interested in looking at temporary residents who are on the Canadian labor market as workers and look at them in conjunction with other immigrant workers. So in general, research separates temporary workers from permanent residents. We have a lot of researchers who do one only, who focus on these two groups separate, only on one of those two groups. I mean, there have been some more recent analyses, and Feng Hao has done a number of them on the transition from temporary to permanent status and the different trajectories and determinants. But overall, there hasn't been that much research done together comparing these two groups. So during the presentation, when we use the term temporary workers, we're not referring to ICRC facts and figure category, the program, international mobility and temporary workers, but more on temporary residents who are on the labor market and who are not in school. So it might be confusing, especially if you work for the government, but that's really who we're talking about, regardless of the program through which they entered Canada. So from these questions, from this literature, we're interested in looking at the effect of immigration status on income, or we could so residence / migration status on income. And in order to do that, we'll look at the census, 2016 census data, and ask the question, how does the income of temporary workers compare to the income of permanent residents in Canada? So that's kind of an unusual approach in terms of analysis and comparison, but we hope to make some progress in trying to unpack those differences. So the first analysis I'll present today is looking at 3 subcategories. So as I mentioned, this is census data, CRDC version. And we kept a subsample, of course, of the census data. I should just make a parenthesis and say, of course, the census undercounts temporary residents, temporary workers. There is an undercount if we compare facts and figure in the census. But we have looked at how these 2 sources of data over time, and we see that it's very steady and regular, and despite the undercount. So it's still a valuable source, especially for income, and so we're trying to make the best of the census with this analysis. So we're comparing 3 subgroups. So we're looking at employees, so wage earners who are employed at the time of the census, and we use Statistics Canada for being employed. So we look at temporary residents, employed, not in school, and we compare them to 2 other subgroups, employed recent immigrants, permanent resident, not in Canada in 2011, again, Statistics Canada definition, versus more established long-term immigrants in Canada 5 years and above. So this is the first analysis. I will start with just a few bivariate graphs before I move on to the multivariate analysis. The first graph shows the distribution of these 3 subgroups by industries using the North American Industry Classification System, the NAICS. So you see in yellow the temporary workers, again, temporary residents who are working. In blue, the recent immigrants, and in green, the established longer-term immigrants. And we see that by industry, there are some differences in how these 3 groups are distributed among these industries. So we note that workers with temporary immigration status are in all industries, but that the largest proportion is in the consumer services. Compared to, so that's the second last group. Compared to permanent residents, they're more likely to be in that industry. In consumer services, this result's not shown, but they're most commonly found in accommodation and food services, temporary workers. Nearly 30%, however, are in production services, but they're less likely to be in these sectors than permanent residents, as you can see. Interestingly, almost 16% of temporary residents who work are in government services, which is about the same as recent immigrants. Now, moving on to another variable that we have in the census. So this graph shows the distribution by immigration status, again, of, according to occupational skill level based on the National Occupational Category, so the NOC 0, A, B, C, D levels. So from A to D is from highest skill to lower skills, and O is more managerial and director positions. So what's striking about this graph is that temporary workers here are very similar to recent immigrants in general. The largest difference is in the lowest skill level, D. And you know, we could discuss afterwards the details of this, but we see that, you know, in terms of A, B, and C, they're very, very similar. The more established immigrants are more represented in the A, as expected, given migration policy and duration of stay. Okay. Moving on to getting closer to our variable of interest here, employment and income. First, we're looking at average weekly hours worked. So this the question. In here, we see that temporary residents work on average more hours than permanent residents, 37.7 versus 36 for recent immigrants and 36.7 for more established immigrants. So another result not shown here is that 68% of temporary workers worked more than 40 hours the week before the census, whereas it was the case for 62% of permanent residents, regardless of time in Canada, so both groups. So this slide indicates that temporary workers are more likely to work more hours weekly. And here is the bivariate result on income, the median weekly employment income. Here we note a very important difference, not surprisingly, I would say, between more established immigrants, the green, 1,000 on average before tax income per week versus 679 for temporary workers. What's interesting, however, is that the temporary workers earn less than the recent immigrants. Of course, this is all statistically significant. And it's even more interesting because, as we've seen on the slide before, they work more on average, more hours on average. So based on these preliminary analysis, we asked the question, what's the role of status, if any, perhaps not, in exploring these differences? So to analyze this question further, we did a linear regression and to look at the income, how to explain this income gap between temporary residents and recent immigrants. So in this next section, I'm strictly looking at, we're leaving the established immigrants aside, and we are strictly comparing recent immigrants and temporary workers. And I should say that this comparison is also interesting because some temporary workers may have been longer in Canada than recent immigrants. So we'll come back to that. So we introduced control variables, socio-demographic characteristics, sex, age, marital status, and knowledge of official languages, place of birth, place of residence, CMAs, employment characteristics, the ones I showed you, NOC and NAICS. We looked at whether they worked full-time or part-time. Charles also created a variable to look at the gap between credentials and job occupied, hours worked in the week, and in the years preceding the census. So based on this, on these variables, so I'll show you the models, and just I wanted to say that we also excluded from our sample employees who had a weekly income below $150 and those who had an income above $7,700. So this roughly excluded about 6% of the sample, with some differences between subcategories. Small, very small ones. So I'm only showing here not to overwhelm you with coefficients. The coefficient for our main explanatory variable, so trying to test status, So we see that all things being equal, what's happening. So we use the stepwise approach. The model 1, we strictly introduce status. And we see that there's a negative effect of status on income. I should say the reference category is recent immigrant with permanent status. So compared to those recent immigrants, having temporary status had a negative effect on income, as noted in the bivariate analysis presented earlier. I think I didn't explain something clearly, right? That the difference between, we introduced temporary workers between those who were recent, and those who were experienced. So that's the next step, sorry. So those who were experienced were in Canada in 2011. And there's a question in the 2016 census, as you know, asking for this question. So that's the comparison we're doing right now. So in Model 2, we add the socio-demographic characteristics. Here, the negative effect of having temporary status on income is maintained. Some variables were statistically significant in this, among these variables. So region of birth, being in the US, being from the US or Europe had a positive effect on income. Not speaking English had a negative effect on income. Being a woman had a negative effect on income. And age also, as expected, well, income increased up to 45 and then declined after. Sorry, I lost the mouse here. Sorry, okay. So in Model 3, sorry, okay. I have a problem here. Is the technical person here? Benoît, excuse me first. J'ai perdu la souris. Ouais.
Qu'est-ce que tu vas faire peut-être?
Ah, ok. Ok, ouais, mais je suis bien. Ça me prend. Ah, ok. Ah, tu l'as vu? C'est pas un écran. OK. OK, c'est pas grave. OK. So sorry. So in Model 3, we introduced the other set of variables, the employment characteristic variables, and we see that the effect of status is maintained, but that it has a slightly different effect depending on whether workers were recent temp or more experienced temporary workers, and that it was kind of had no effect for recent, but it had a worsening effect for experienced temporary workers. So we, on the basis of this first model, we conducted two other analyses in which we decided to look at skill levels and separate the two subgroups. So that's the next step I'm introducing here in 5 minutes. So for skilled workers only, we have skilled workers only in Model 4, and we have low and unskilled only in Model 5. So what we see, first of all, is that in Model 4, the negative effect of status on income for experienced workers only, that, while recent temporary workers do as well as recent immigrants, being longer in Canada is negative for skilled temporary workers. With respect to weekly incomes, this corresponds to about an $80 wage gap between the two subgroups. In Model 5, which is only for the low and unskilled workers, being a recent temporary worker has a negative impact on income, while more experienced ones benefit from higher incomes. So we could see that experienced temporary workers earn more than recent immigrants, all things being equal. So all of this suggests that having a Canadian experience for workers with temporary status is beneficial for lower skilled workers, but not as beneficial for higher skilled workers. That's good. You know, we could, that's kind of our main big result, like from this analysis. And we can make several hypotheses from that. Of course, skilled temporary workers have access to permanent residency. So, you know, many of them will have made the transition to permanent status, and perhaps the ones who are still in that category are the ones who have done less well. And, you know, that could be something to explore because it's hard to really explain that result. In terms of the lower skilled ones who are doing better over time, there's also, we noticed that in, let's say, the agricultural sectors, there's a loyalty towards employers among those who keep returning to Canada, and their working conditions may improve over time. However, they cannot change their status, so they stay longer in that category. So that could be some of the explanations. If you have other hypotheses, of course, we're welcoming them in the discussion. So to conclude, our results do not really contradict critical literature. Status matters, but you know, how does it matter and why is something we don't really answer with this analysis yet. We would need much more detailed data. But we see that there are, when we control for socio-demographic characteristics and employment characteristics, that there are some interesting dynamics going on. But certainly, it's something we wish to continue analyzing. But the census opens doors, raises a lot of questions. But of course, with the undercount, and we need more precise data to continue. Thank you.